I'll begin by asking each of the panelists for maybe just 2 minutes on what they see, how they see the session shaping up. And Peter, Jim, Mary Ellen, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It's a distinguished panel, as John said. Mary Ellen, we'll start with you. If you've got a couple of minutes on how you see things shaping up for this session.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. You know, this is going to be a historic session for the simple reason that it is coming in a once in a century pandemic. The logistics, as John and Marty know well, the logistics of navigating a session are generally not easy, but doing it, trying to make sure that a critical mass of legislators don't get infected and thus delay essential votes is even more critical. So it's really of this session, I think, are going to be something that will go down in history. A lot of questions are being raised about access and public access, simply because you've also got to balance the nature of what's happening with safety. In spite of that, I think the legislature has a really full agenda. I wouldn't call it ambitious. I would just simply say that they've put a lot of stuff out there. And among them is going to be the first bill I think that's going to get addressed is a liability bill that will basically make sure that businesses are protected from frivolous lawsuits related to COVID-19. There's another bill moving that I think is going to be a little more difficult for them to pass, and that is liability protection for nursing homes, hospitals, healthcare providers, also related to COVID-19. And one of the first bills to make it off the floor of the House is going to crack down on scammers who provide fraudulent information about COVID vaccines and so forth. There is going to be talk about fixing the state's system. I don't think I just haven't seen a lot of movement for critical action related to that. The other thing that is very important is Florida is today the opening of the CPAC convention. Florida is establishing itself as the nation's conservative, you know, the home of the conservative party, of Republican conservatives. And so I think they're going to be using this session very effectively to draw attention to the priorities that matter to the conservatives in the Republican Party. And that also helps the governor with his priorities. His priorities, he's already laid out. He's going to focus on a riot bill, for example. He is trying to give the attention to big tech. After Donald Trump was deplatformed for instigating rioters, there is a lot of attention paid to what can the state do. I think there's a lot of more friction on that bill than appears at this point. We can talk more about that later. And then the other element is that's a very important issue for conservatives is this notion of election reform. And I think that is a two-edged sword because there were many Republicans that benefited from mail-in balloting as well as Democrats, but but Republicans are counting, and they know that when they restrict mail-in balloting, they're going to restrict more Democrats than Republicans. So that's really just the top lines. There's a lot of other things we can get into, but I'll leave it to my the co-panelists here to elevate some other issues.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen. Jim, what do you think?
You know, I was listening to Mary Ellen, and I pretty much agree with everything she said about, you know, a lot of high points she hit. I think one other thing that, you know, it's crucial in every session, but this year I think it's even more is the budget. Um, the pandemic has really hurt state revenues. Just look at the tourism industry, for instance. Tourism was down 34% over last year, and that includes the first quarter, which was relatively normal. So there's billion-dollar questions, couple billion-dollar questions about how uh, they're going to balance the budget this year. Governor DeSantis came up with a very ambitious $96.6 billion budget proposal, which a lot of legislators pretty much immediately expressed skepticism about, let's put it that way, about how it was funded. There are a lot of issues with federal money that has been baked into that. There's a lot of questions about how much more federal money will be available this year, this coming year, and how they're going to put together the budget. So I think that's going to be a major. Again, it's always a major issue how they're going to, what the budget's going to look like. But this year, I think there's even more questions than usual because of all the uncertainty about revenues, about where we're going with the pandemic. So I think that's from a policy perspective, other than what Mary Ellen touched on, which I agree with her on a lot of those points. I do think the budget is sort of going to be a dominant big picture issue. Also, just sort of to piggyback on what Mary Ellen was referring to, I think Peter was starting to go there too, but I couldn't quite hear him. But on the the great cliche is elections have consequences, of course. And, I think this November, in November 2020, the election did have big consequences. The Democrats thought they were going to pick up seats, and they wound up losing seats. And most importantly, they lost a seat in the Senate. And I think that has sort of fueled some of this, helped fuel some of the conservative direction this legislature is going. Also, I think we need to look forward to 2022. I don't think it's too early. I mean, you watch Governor DeSantis out there; it's almost like campaign events already. So, and a lot of the legislation that Mary Ellen referred to, obviously, is very popular with the base, the Republican base. So, I think we're already shifting into 2022, and we have Nikki Fried on the other side, as well as other Democrats, but they're already hammering away at the governor. So I think this session is going to be a reflection of 2020 and 22 from that standpoint.
Jim, well, I don't know if we've got Peter back, but seeing him on a boat reminded me of sea level rise and climate change. And so I'm wondering, Mary Ellen, this is for you, since you're with the Herald. What do you think? Is the state going to focus on that? Republicans are talking about climate change. I wouldn't have expected that a couple of years ago.
It's very interesting that they are very attuned to the need to address it. And so just today, the House Speaker has announcing a plan to, quote, mitigate the effects of flooding and sea level rise in Florida. The governor and the House and Senate leadership have done a very good job of addressing the effects. But critics, environmental critics, and people in the climate resilience community are very unhappy that they're not at all interested in the causes of climate change. So that's where there's some tension. The governor has proposed a $1 billion bonding initiative that would allow for money to go into infrastructure projects that do exactly like build seawalls and reinforce areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. The House has indicated they are not at all interested in bonding. And so I haven't looked at the House Speaker's plan in depth, but my guess is that he's trying to address this need without bonding. Now, the question the practical question I think that needs to be asked is, we've got, once in a century, some of the lowest bonding or the lowest debt costs. Why does it make sense not to bond right now for long-term needs? But that is something that is a very Republican. It's a clash within the party on how that's going to go down, and it'll be interesting to see how far the governor wants to push that. He has made himself early on a friend of the environmental community with his support of some of the Everglades projects. So, and this is a very popular issue, as you mentioned, in South Florida, and a very needed thing for Republicans to be addressing.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much, Mary Ellen. Jim, you mentioned the governor's budget. So we see this, every year. How do you think, we've got a new speaker, a new Senate president, how do you think they're going to, how do you see them getting along? How do you see them getting along with the governor? And, how's that relationship shaping up? Those relationships.
I think at this point it's okay. I do think the budget, there's a lot of questions about how they're going to bring this in for a landing, and the bonding is one of the issues. It's not just about the resiliency issue, but there's other bond proposals that the governor has made to help shore up his budget, and both in the House and the Senate, his people went and made presentations to the House and Senate committees, and there was just a lot of skepticism about, do we have this much money, and are there games being played essentially with how his proposal was funded. Again, I don't want to overstate the case because that's not unusual. I remember when Charlie Crist was governor, and a Republican legislator who a lot of you would know told me that he took Crist's budget and threw it in the garbage. So I mean, that there is that tension, or those questions are always there, but I think that's one area where we do see a difference. I think that the House Speaker, by the way, apparently his proposal, I caught a little bit of it today, would be to spend $100 million a year on resiliency, climate resiliency projects. We're still trying to sort out the details, but I think that is not bonded money. But regardless, on that issue, at least, it appears to me that the governor and the House Speaker and the Senate President are fairly well aligned in terms of what they want to do. Now, how they pay for it may be a different issue, but just generally the direction they want to go seems to me to be fairly similar. You also got to remember that the House Speaker, Chris Fowles, is from Pinellas County, which, like Miami-Dade, is ground zero for impacts of climate change. I mean, Pinellas County is pretty low ground. And the Senate President, Wilton Simpson's from Pasco County, which I think he's probably inland, but Pasco County probably has the same problems. So this is a little home cooking of an issue for them as well. But I think they're fairly well aligned on it. And some of the other issues, I just think it's going to have to play out a little bit. And I think money's a big issue. But again, I think, for instance, another big issue that we're going to see this year is a very ambitious school vouchers program, which has already started moving through the system, or through the Senate. And the Speaker was asked about last week because it hasn't started moving through the House, and he pretty much said, we love school choice, and we're going to look at the Senate plan, and which indicated to me it's going to happen. And we know the governor's for school choice. So, I think on some of those big picture issues, they're fairly well aligned. I don't get the sense that, for instance, the Senate President, I think there was a story about this, that, he's all that crazy about this issue with with cracking down on Facebook and Amazon and that just isn't his priority. But it appears that the governor and the Speaker are very enthused about it. And, things get worked out. I mean, deals get cut all the time, as you guys know. So.
If I
Jim,
could just inject one little thing that we haven't touched on at all that is tangential to the sea level rise question, and that is there's a lot of bills that are moving that relate to preemption. I mean, it's a phenomenal number of them. And there's a whole suite of bills that are designed to help the natural gas industry, the electric utilities industry, petroleum companies, that basically would prevent local governments from imposing any kinds of limits. So if there's a local government that wants to make all new buildings be greenhouse gas friendly and not use natural gas or other sources, that these bills would preempt them. Same with electric utilities. Only electric utility solar gets preference. Any local government that wants to put limits on solar farms, for example, would be preempted. So you've got this back and forth happening where on one hand, we want to put a lot of money into resiliency from climate change, but when it comes to the causes of climate change, we're going to make sure that local governments can't do too much if they disagree with the state's direction. And I think that's an interesting tension to watch. I also think that it is a bipartisan tension. In other words, I don't think voters necessarily align clearly on those issues.
Marianne, I want to follow up that with you on this issue of protecting intellectual freedoms, and there's a proposal there, and how you feel about that. Sounds like there's a Republican move afoot there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting issue because this is not new. The arrival of the growing dominance of the tech platforms from Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon, their increasing influence has been mounting for a decade. And they've noticed that in Congress, and it's been an issue that Congress has refused to address. And basically they have been the social media is the public square today, and big tech, the word is big tech, but these social media platforms have been able to write the rules about whose speech is allowed. And that is a First Amendment right. They're private companies and they have a right to decide, what their rules are. But when the president was deplatformed after January 6th, that got Republican conservatives' attention. And now they are focused on sort of how did big tech become the referees here in free speech? And that's an issue that has been, developing for a long time. It's a very important debate, I think. But the question is, what can the state do? One of their proposals is to limit if a company violates its terms of service and deplatforms somebody without giving them proper notice, or because they had conservative speech, then that company should know, like Amazon or Facebook, should not have any contracts with the state of Florida. That's the state's way to limit them. However, it's really going to be difficult for them, I think, to constitutionally pass a law that says once you are inside Florida's borders, then you can't deplatform somebody. Then your First Amendment right to write your own rules change. It's just a very difficult thing to pass, I think, the legal standards and constitutional muster. So what I think is going to happen is they're going to whittle that down, and it's going to be a statement bill that the governor passes. It will be a little bit like some of the immigration legislation we've passed, where it's whittled down and it's really just symbolic in the end. That's because I think otherwise they're going to be facing litigation and these big tech companies will take the state to task.
Thanks. Just a quick reminder to our audience, if you have questions, please fill them out with the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Send them on in. Thanks.
Hey, Jim, I got one for you. Lawmakers are considering a proposal that would require out-of-state retailers to collect sales taxes on purchases made by Floridians. We've seen that before. Do you think that'll pass this year?
Well, it's got support in the Senate. It's already started moving forward in the Senate. The tricky part of this issue and why it's died every year from, probably the last 5 or 6, I don't know how many years it's been out there, but is that nobody wants to look like they're raising taxes. So, a lot of online purchases are already, the sales tax is already collected. I mean, if you buy something through Amazon, they are collecting the sales tax because they're legally required to, because they have a quote unquote physical presence in Florida. But if you buy something from, order something from up the border in Brunswick, Georgia, and that business up there will ship it to you and they won't collect the Florida sales tax. So this issue's been out there a long time, and the Florida retailers have been lobbying for it for years and years and years, as well as other business groups, saying it's just unfair that they have to, collect the sales tax and add that extra 6-7% onto a bill, and that it's unfair to brick and mortar retailers. But the Republican legislators have been very leery about doing anything that's going to look like a tax increase on consumers. I mean, you can almost write the mail pieces in a campaign with, Representative XYZ raised your taxes on that internet purchase. So, I mean, you understand what they're worried about, but it started moving in the Senate. It hasn't moved in the House yet. The other thing that was sort of a good indicator, though, last week was that the Senate, one of the Senate committees, they are talking about trying to make it revenue neutral. In other words, collecting this tax on these retail sales. I mean, it's like $1 billion. It's hundreds of millions of dollars of potential revenue. It's not a small bite of change. It's a big number. But in this committee last week, they started talking about making it revenue neutral. In other words, they would start collecting this tax on internet sales, but they would offset it by tax cuts in another area. One of the ideas they're talking about, which again, it's been out there for years and years, and it's also a big priority of a lot of Florida businesses, is to reduce a sales tax on commercial leases. So they ostensibly they would, or could increase start collecting this internet sales tax and cut the lease tax by a similar number. That way they would try to shield themselves from being considered a tax increase. I'm not really sure that flies because, I don't pay commercial lease tax, but you know what? If I bought something on the internet, I'd be paying 7% more under that plan. I don't know. So I just think the political implication has always killed it in the past. With all that said, there's a whole bunch of Republican-controlled states, at least my understanding, that are collecting this tax. It's not like it's, in fact, what allows it was a Supreme Court case out of South Dakota, which is a very conservative-led state, and South Dakota came up with some model legislation that has been the basis for Florida and other states. So I think it'll get a lot of attention. I'm not convinced it'll pass at this point.
Can I just add a little thought onto that? I'm going to handicap this issue a little differently. I think this is the year, and the reason is Wilton Simpson has made this an issue that he is embracing. It's also a year where, as we've mentioned, COVID has dismantled the retailers in this state, and if they really want to help that industry, this is at least a symbolic gesture to get them at least on an even playing field with all the e-commerce companies that are not that do not have a presence in Florida and can sell products but not collect and remit taxes. Florida's only one of the 45 states that collect sales tax. Only Florida and Missouri do not require e-commerce companies to submit sales tax. So I think that Wilton Simpson does not call this a tax increase. He calls it a fairness issue. I think if he's willing to put his heft behind this, this could be an issue that gets changed this year. And I think it's also likely to happen this year in the 2-year cycle and not next year. If they do it this year, maybe the idea that they've raised taxes on somebody by next year will not sting as much in an election year.